So we just had this conversation, well, this talk at Stockholm University for our teaching, and it's really great to have you here. And you mentioned during the talk, you said this is the first time since October 7th that you've talked in public about what happened. But in the meantime, you've also written in exchanges. I think in the Swedish left press, and I wondered if you can talk a little bit about those exchanges. If you're surprised by the sort of arguments that you've had, maybe articulate those with your feelings after October 7th.
Well, I don't really have engaged in exchanges. I wrote a very brief piece that was a kind of an ironic piece about the compulsion to condemn Hamas. Apart from that, I haven't really engaged in the Swedish debates. I've been pretty annoyed by what I've seen, but I haven't followed the Swedish debate closely. But the way that the events were received by outlets like Dagens ETC or Flamman or Aftonbladet Kultur struck me as extremely poor and badly informed and cowardly and without any kind of moral compass or stamina, and also extremely poor on knowledge about, for instance, what Hamas is. Where people just churn out all sorts of cliches about Hamas being fascist or Hamas wanting to annihilate the Jewish people all over the world without them having studied Hamas for a second, not having read, not having listened, not knowing the scholarly work on Hamas. Just refusing to engage with what kind of a movement it is, where it comes from, what it represents.
Yeah, I think many of us had that reaction. I was struck in something you also brought up in your talk. In a certain sense, perhaps I was not so surprised that in the current sort of Islamophobic moment that we're inhabiting and have been for a while, the kind of collective fear of a Muslim planet, as you put it. I was not perhaps so surprised that would be the way in which Hamas was interpolated, but I was surprised by the way in which Israel and this particular Israeli government was embraced in a kind of an unconditional sense by the not only by the right, but in fact, they have voices from, for instance, etc., talking about Israel's right to defend itself.
Yeah, it's incredibly dismaying, but it just speaks to how weak the left is and how much it has retreated in Sweden on questions of Palestine and Palestinian resistance. I mean, the situation is incomparable with what it was like 20 years ago. Or even at the time of the first war in Gaza in 2008-9, we've lost so much ground in terms of organizational structures, but also in terms of the discourse in media and the complete absence of Palestinian voices, also very different from what it was like in the 1990s, for instance, when Gandhian published Edward Said and Palestinians living in Sweden regularly. I mean, there are no Palestinian voices in the Swedish public debate, with extremely few exceptions, and they are out in the margins. So there is a complete dominance of the narrative that this is all about anti-Semitism, and that the real problem here is anti-Semitism.
Were you, if you're talking about the sort of the allies that fell away, how would you relate the response to what's happening in Palestine now to the way in which the left, and you can classify, you can sort of draw the boundaries of that how you want, but how they relate to the sort of the broader question of racism in Sweden, the stances they've taken on that. Again, I understand that it's difficult for you to actually follow the Swedish media on this, but it's a big, it's of course something you've written about, this fossil fascism.
Yeah, I mean Sweden's descent into completely, how shall I put it, established and accepted and generally diffused racism is remarkable, and it just continues. I mean, the Sweden Democrats breaking this most recent taboo by declaring that we're going to raise the mosques in this country is just one more sign of where we're going. And of course, the Sweden Democrats are the real kingmakers and power brokers in this country, the real foundation for the government that we have, even though they're in the background. There are no indications that they're losing the ground. To the contrary, they're just growing stronger. And there's also no indication that they are becoming more pragmatic and moderate and, blunting their edges. To the contrary, again, they're radicalizing, as some of us warned that they would. The more accepted they become, the more extreme. So the whole political spectrum is just drifting boundlessly towards the far right. And I don't see any forces in Sweden that are putting up the fight that needs to be put up against this. I'm certainly not doing an effort on this front because I'm not active in this country in any form. So I don't say that I'm in any way not part of this absence of fighting back. I really am. But the situation in this country is extremely depressing. It's depressing in other countries too. It's extremely depressing in Germany. It's very different in France, where you have real forces of the left taking extremely good positions on Palestine. I mean, the difference couldn't be starker between the position taken by La France Insoumise and Jean-Luc Mélenchon or the NPA and what the left party has been doing here. But that's because La France Insoumise, which is the only real formation of the radical left that is useful at this present moment, I think, in any major country in Western Europe. There's none in the UK since Corbyn, and Keir Starmer is just a joke. And the Die Linke is collapsing in Germany. Obviously, there's some stuff happening in Austria. Podemos is very weak. The Italian left is virtually non-existing. But in France, we have La France Insoumise, and they have made a very deliberate and concerted and systematic effort to mobilize non-white populations in the suburbs. And Mélenchon has been extremely effective in gaining support from these constituencies and drawing them into the political conversation and the mobilization of the left through social struggles recently. And part of this is his very consistent pro-Palestinian position, whereas the left party here is just so... Well, I don't even know where to begin. And the danger here is, of course, that they will lose the suburbs because they're so unable to stand up for Palestine in the way that they should.
I think the sense of betrayal is such a profound, so profoundly and deeply felt. Ghassan Haja, anthropologist, Lebanese origin, but taught in Australia for a long time, has described this moment sort of across the world as a kind of moment in which minority constituents are being unbelonged all around the world. This interpolation of can you condemn Hamas really being the moment in which you are told that you can come into the gate or not. I mean, this is it.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's even formalized. In Germany now, you have to proclaim your loyalty to the state of Israel to get citizenship or whatever. And all this talk in Sweden about we're going to deport people and strip them of their citizenship if they voice anything like support for Hamas. I mean, it's completely bizarre.
Are you worried?
Yes, of course. I don't know where this country is going or where this. It's anyway. It's not surprising because Europe is the cradle of fascism. It's the cradle of colonialism in modern times. It's the cradle of fossil fuel combustion. So these things are coming back to roost in their home yard. I mean, Europe is. Yeah, I mean, you have to take the Fanonian position on Europe.
Yeah, I think that's a nice segue to a question that I did want to ask you also. You end, how to blow up a pipeline, learning to fight in a world on fire, with musing that there has been a time for a Gandhian climate movement. Perhaps now there's come a time for a Fanonian one.
Yeah, I mean, to me, Fanon has long been a source of inspiration. I'm not by any means an expert on him, but I think that the case can be made for a climate movement that takes its inspiration from him and from radical movements in the anti-colonial struggles and in the global South, rather than this fetishization of a particular form of non-violence from Gandhi. That has been the hegemonic protocol, if you like, in the climate movement in Europe and elsewhere for many years. And I think we're starting to see that also. And so much of the climate movement globally is, of course, based in the South. But in the North also, you see more experimentation with tactics that go beyond the Gandhian conceptualization of non-violent civil disobedience. So there are positive signs, even though they're still extremely limited, I would say. Yeah.
One of the sort of talking points in my own experience after October 7th among academics in the United States, academics in Europe who identify themselves as being progressive in one way or another, was precisely the manner in which they felt it was appropriate to invoke Fanon. And I personally sort of entered into a very strange argument on Facebook with someone, an Israeli academic who was furious that we were now theorizing what was happening. There was a moment of empathy that he felt was missing. And I understand that it was a traumatic moment for him, but it really also struck me that this was a moment of cleavage within, let's say, an intellectual world for many. And I wondered, you've, of course, you will understand, I'm sure, Naomi Klein as a co-traveler.
But I didn't
express a lot of admiration for her.
I wasn't impressed by her piece. No,
yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I don't now exactly recall what she wrote, so I can't refer it. We've read so much over these 2 months, haven't we? So it's difficult to remember exactly everything. But her point was to always side with the child against the gun, right?
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, clearly you can say that. Now, what that means, given what we know now, is that you side with the Palestinians against the state of Israel that has killed, what is it now? Is it 5,000 or is it 10,000 children in Gaza? We don't know, but it's completely incomparable with what happened on the 7th of October. And of course, you can take the position that it's always wrong to kill children, and I agree, it is. It's always bad to kill children. The children that were killed during the 7th of October shouldn't have been killed. The extent of the killing of children during that day isn't exactly clear to me. I know of evidence that one baby, infant, was killed during that day. That's obviously one too much. The circumstances of that death, I do not know, and I don't know how many children as a whole were killed, but obviously she's right, and I'm happy to repeat this, that none of these children should have been killed. there's a problem with the idea of framing what's going on in Palestine in symmetrical terms, as in it's always wrong to kill civilians. We should condemn the killing of civilians on both sides, and to constantly harp on this theme of symmetry, that you are against the killing of children on that side, you're against the killing of children on that side. You're against the killing of civilians on that side, you're against the killing of civilians on that side. You think violence is bad from that side and from that side. They have to sit down and talk and solve this. This kind of symmetrical understanding of the conflict is one that has been dominant in the West. Although, I mean, obviously, mostly it's an asymmetry because in reality, the support is for the state of Israel. But this kind of understanding of the conflict, I mean, it stood at its height during the 1990s, during the years of the so-called peace process, and it took us absolutely nowhere. Because, I mean, this conflict will never end unless we break with that symmetrical paradigm and understand that the entire conflict is structured by a fundamental asymmetry, which is between the occupier and the occupied, between the colonizer and the colonized. And this means that the meaning, for instance, of a dead soldier in Israeli uniform is different than the meaning of a dead Palestinian fighter who doesn't wear a uniform. Maybe he doesn't even wear shoes. A lot of the fighters in Gaza now are fighting barefoot. So I don't accept the idea that there is a symmetry between these two types of death. I see a dead Palestinian resistance fighter as a martyr. I see a dead Israeli occupation soldier as a legitimate target for the resistance fighters. I think that the killing of civilians perpetrated by the Palestinian resistance on October the 7th, however much you want to deplore it, and I do, it's qualitatively different in its political meaning from the mass killing of civilians in Gaza, or the West Bank for that matter. Because it's one thing when a resistance kills civilian colonizers, and it's another thing when the repressive occupation in genocidal mode kills the civilians that it seeks to destroy and drive out of the land. And we'll never see this conflict come to an end before we make these distinctions and fundamentally solve this conflict by ending the occupation. Now, I'm happy to accept the symmetrical basic idea that she sort of, I guess, wanted to highlight in that moment, that it's always wrong to kill children. Fine. We can accept that symmetry on both sides. And as far as I know, Naomi Klein, I would imagine that by now, 2 months later, she is primarily upset with the state of Israel and what it's been doing and the mass murder of children that it has perpetrated. But I think my initial reaction to that piece, that I don't, like I said, remember very clearly, was that it was a very superficial, again, understanding of the events on October 7th.
This was the article that Naomi Klein published in The Guardian.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things that Fanon talks about, right, this is one of the sort of his most fundamental points, is that there is no possibility of a kind of if one thinks in terms of symmetries, there's no possibility of a recognition between the colonized and the colonizer. Because for the colonized to recognize the colonizer is to enact their own erasure in a certain sense. And it struck me that in a certain sense, wasn't this what a sort of a whole body of intellectuals were at that moment asking, in the sense that they were centering and foregrounding their own demand to feel my pain in this moment, my pain, you know. Sure. And is that not the demand for this impossible recognition?
Yes. No, absolutely. You put it very well. I mean, then you can, of course, make the argument that some students made here who came up to me afterwards, that there is a difference between the Algerian situation that Fanon describes and the situation in Palestine. And the situation is that ultimately, of course, the goal in Palestine is that Palestinians and Jews live together in the land with equal rights. And that the Palestinian political project has never been about eliminating the Jewish presence in Palestine. That's just an invented, fabricated position that the national movement has never taken. In Algeria, the liberation struggle was about really throwing the Pieds Noirs, the settlers, into the sea and getting them out and getting them to go back to their metropole and leave Algeria alone to the Arabs. So there was never a need for any kind of recognition in that sense between the native population of Algeria and the French settlers. The solution, the equation was solved by with one factor being deleted. It's going to be different in Palestine because it's going to have to end with a kind of recognition. And this, of course, includes, and this a lot of Palestinian intellectuals, Edward Said being the pioneer here, have worked with this. This includes a recognition and an understanding of the pain accumulated throughout Jewish history. And the way that it works in the Jewish population that resides in Palestine. This, of course, makes things more complicated than they were in Algeria. And, progressive Israelis would say that what happened on the 7th of October was so destructive because it touched the rawest nerve in the Jewish psyche, which is the fear of obliteration, the fear of violence that has been, sedimented over the generations from the experience of anti-Semitism in Europe. And I can understand that point. But the problem here again, and this is something that I touched upon, and this is also something that makes the situation so complex, is that perception is fundamentally rooted in what other people than the Palestinians have done to the Jews. And the psychic perception and experience from the Palestinian side regarding what happened on the 7th of October is anchored in the actual reality in the place, which is the reality of colonial occupation. Now, the way that the violence on the 7th of October was perceived and mediated in the Israeli public was through the filter of centuries of events that have taken place in Europe and not in Palestine. You see what I mean? Yeah. So this is one reason that, Jews and Palestinians are fundamentally condemned to live together in Palestine and find some kind of way to recognize each other. But the problem is that to a very large extent, they live in different psychic realities. And that the Palestinian reality is the one that is anchored in the actual physical reality of the occupation, whereas the Israeli reality is very largely predetermined by things that have happened that have no connection with the Palestinians. And that it's through these sedimentations that ongoing events in Palestine are filtered to an extremely destructive effect.
What I really appreciated among many other things about your talk, is that you brought up the necessity of trying to understand October the 7th in the manner that so many Palestinians did and could not but understand it, which was precisely as an act of resistance. Something on which I think it would be safe to say that that's actually an impossible statement to make in public in Sweden.
Sure, but it's bizarre. I mean, if we just look at the first hours of the Tufan al-Aqsa operation, and we wait for a moment with discussing the civilian deaths, then clearly the act of people flying out of the prison, breaking the wall, going to the lands from which they were expelled, in many cases for the first time, seeing the lands outside of the ghetto, the concentration camp in which these people have been locked up for so many years, and stepping out on the land from which these people have been expelled. These were scenes of incredible liberation. I mean, they were incredibly also transient and short-lived scenes, but the memory of them will live for long. because no one could really have imagined that the Palestinians could accomplish something like this completely on their own, with no external support. I mean, obviously, Hamas and Jihad and the other resistance factions have some external support, but a lot of their capacity, including their arms nowadays, of course, are manufactured inside Gaza, even physically inside Gaza, I mean, under the ground. And it's very clear that no external actor had any kind of knowledge of this operation, so it was a 100% fundamentally Palestinian creation. And that's, of course, what made it so enormously provoking and intolerable for the state of Israel that the Palestinians, of their own agency and autonomy, could inflict the most disastrous defeat on the Israeli military in its entire history, which goes some way to explain the Israeli reaction. Now, having also, having been to Gaza, having crossed the Eretz checkpoint, having seen the military towers, of course, it was impossible not to feel a total sense of surreal exhilaration and excitement that the Palestinians could storm these fortifications, these towers, and take over them and pull down the Israeli flag. Yes. Then what happened next? We've discussed in the conversation with the mass killings at the Supernova Festival, the scenes in Kibbutz Be'eri and the other kibbutzes. That's where the jubilation stops, obviously. And you have to go into the very complicated questions of why did these things happen?
I mean, again, I thought that's precisely the point that you make, which is so difficult to translate in a tractable discourse in the media, which is that it is possible to feel more than one thing about a particular event, that we can feel many things at the same time, in fact. But there's an article by Ben Ehrenreich, an interview with Asma al-Ghul, a Palestinian from Gaza who's went on a hunger strike when the war started. And in this article, she recounts what a trauma the war of 2014 on Gaza was for her and her family. And she talks about her complicated reaction to October 7th. But what she said was, I think, something that very much echoes with your argument here, which is this feeling of something impossible had become possible. And in that moment, one therefore had to wonder what else is possible.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it now suddenly possible to think about liberation in a new way? There was, I think...
That's how so many Palestinians felt, and not only Palestinians, but people who cared about Palestinians around the world. And that's why Israel goes to such great length to completely eradicate this moment of open possibilities and completely close it and bury it under rubble.
How to Blow Up a Pipeline ends with you breaching a fence.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure this can be compared.
But you also describe it, right? This is an action where you are attacking the Schwarze Pumpe, or the black pump, this gigantic power station in Germany, and you describe a sense of something akin to this feeling, of the impossible having become possible. The moment you break, you don't even know what to do once you've broken through.
Yes.
Have you returned to that scene?
I actually haven't thought about it. Yeah, there's a point, of course, but also great differences between these fences and their characters. But yes, I mean, the world is becoming completely full, crisscrossed by borders and walls and fences, hemming people in, enclosing them, locking them out, blocking them, to defend various kinds of privileges. And liberation then means, to a very large extent, breaking down those walls and opening them. This act is glorified in liberal discourse when it comes to the destruction of the Berlin Wall in 1989. But since then, walls under this neoliberal hegemony we're living in have only proliferated. But some people around the world still invest emancipatory hopes in the idea of destroying walls. I think there are so many walls that need to be torn down, and the walls in Palestine are among the most extreme. But like I argued in the world in the lecture, the events, what's happening in Palestine is connected to the rest of the world, and the border regime in Palestine has served as a kind of prototype for border regimes that are erected all over the world, most concretely by the spread of Israeli technology for border control and crowd control and whatnot, counterinsurgency, everything, to other parts of the world. So yeah, there's a lot at stake in opening and destroying the fences and the walls around the Palestinians. And it's in that light that the events on the morning of the 7th of October should be seen. And of course, the hope is that this wasn't the last time that a wall came down. It was the first time.